It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the first speaker of the evening. He graduated from CEPT and he established his practice in Ahmedabad called Anthill Design. The practice involves itself in building design, research, and academics. And as you can imagine, with that kind of width, he will have plenty to talk about. I know him personally, and I particularly find his ideas of incrementality in architecture very compelling, which is an architecture that grows and evolves and gets built over time in its use and in its living. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Riyaz Tayyibji.
Thank you, Madhav. Thank you to the other curators, and particularly to Mr. Khandelwal, for this incredible platform. I'm a little bit nervous this evening because in front of all the eminent photographers, I have to say that as much as I am fascinated by the architectural photograph, I am deeply suspicious of it. And I'd like to share a little bit of why I say this. And Sudipto has already started off by saying that we live in a culture where the image has become ubiquitous. Everywhere you go, you are bombarded with images of all kinds, and it's very, very difficult and becomes much more important to be able to say which are the images that are those that we can appropriate for an architectural process. It is not, when I say that I am suspicious of the image, it is not because it insinuates fact when it is in fact an extremely subjective mode of representation. I say this because with very, very small shifts, the photograph can make something that is extremely intimate quite remote. I want to use some of the photographs of our own work to be able to talk about this. This is a photograph of a house done in Udaipur, which we took great efforts to kind of meld into the landscape, and the house sits on a very, very rocky site. And this has become for our firm the quintessential project, the quintessential photograph that represents this project. And it is, in its completion, talks about the scale and the way it kind of sits within the rock and on that cliff, and the kind of merging with the landscape and all of that. But the photograph is a little bit of a fallacy, because it can never tell you about what we did to that landscape in order to get this particular image to become real. It can never tell you about what the rock was earlier, and it can never tell you the kind of violence that we inflicted on that land to get that serenity of the horizontal. It can never tell you about the kind of ways in which we inhabited the site before the building itself did so. It can never tell you about the different positions that were taken in order to get the serenity of that particular image. These are all various times of the processes of the building. And in that sense, when I talk about incrementality, or when I talk about a building in time, I am talking about the reality of all its avatars and all the ways in which the building inhabits the context in which it is. In order to actually get this so-called intimacy between the building and the rock, there was a great deal of destruction that we had to do in order to bring it this close. This is a little bit of the literal side of things, but there's a more pervasive kind of doubt that I have. This is a photograph that I took of another project, which was a house in Bangalore, which had a particular kind of light, and we were very careful with the kind of materials we wanted to use and the nature of inwardness that the spaces were to work with, were to achieve. We were approached, we were young architects at this time, just starting out our career, and a magazine approached us to do a feature on this particular project. This is what they did to the space. The extremely wide-angle photograph, the stretching of space, the excessive light, all of which was completely at odds with what the spatiality that we were working with. The house actually sits on a street and there was a particular sequence of layers that we worked with in order to break down the scale of a fairly large house from the street. You enter through a series of courtyards which are broken in scale, and yet this is the published photograph. which gives you a sense of largeness, distance, and what I find difficult is the kind of opposition to all that we were trying to achieve. Following this, we have become somewhat reticent in publishing our work. Recently, one of my favorite houses, that of B.V. Doshi, was published by a magazine, and they did pretty much the same to this particular space, which is actually one of great intimacy and great inwardness and homeliness. So what I would like to say is that the problem with the photograph for me is not that it tries to represent the building. The problem with the photograph for me is that it becomes the end or the standalone image with which we try to represent our buildings. And I think what one has to do is look at it as part of a much larger ecology of images that we use when we are working with design. We are all familiar, and every office and every practitioner will have their own ecology of images. And this will range from this preparatory sketch, the ones that we go to record and kind of internalize spaces that are important to us. There are, of course, those which are the conceptual sketches and those which we use in order to think out architecture. There are speculations of different types where we use medias, and we certainly use the computer computer-generated images. But what I propose is that one must work on that and not look at the image as an end in itself. There are other types of speculations which are generative, iterative, and all of these form the plethora of images that one encounters as one produces the work of architecture. There is, of course, modeling, and this is where some of the problems begin, where the aspirations of the final building tie into the images of modeling that we do, some of them shown by Sudipto, where before you've even completed the process of design, the building is already fait accompli. Which all means that the image of architecture leads to a finality. It becomes the kind of casket into which your building is then lowered. And so what I'm saying is that one must look at the photograph as part of an internal process that is worked upon and that one works with, along with the hand, along with other media, along with all the kind of processes that can distort it and work it into the ideas rather than it being representative of the ideas separately. There are, of course, presentations, but I think that, and one looks at being able to convey an idea and convey the possibility of a reality. I think the problem lies is when the reality and the possibility of the reality come too close. There are, of course, mechanical representations and images that we work with as well. And so what I'm saying about this image is not that the image is not of the house, or that I find that it is not sufficient. But what I find is that it has closed the process by which I can think about architecture. By making this the final image of the house, I no longer am able to engage with that building because I'm always holding on to this particular image. And I find that the more and more finite and particular images become, the less one is able to take the building into an afterlife. As part of a recent work done for a recent exhibition, we decided that this is a very important conversation that must take place between architects. So we took 4 buildings, but I will show you 2 done by other architects without their permission, but with their blessings. And these are buildings that are extremely visible. So this is the Folly House by Bus Ride Studio in Bombay. A very quirky kind of project in which furniture is designed as what the architects call as follies, and they transform and you can climb onto them, and they're really like little devices that you engage with. And the house has been photographed, it has been videographed, there are documentaries on it in a very, very short period of time. And the image of the house is completely fixed, which doesn't allow you to think about what does it mean to live among gadgets, which is what is one way that I would take the conversation further. So we started looking at how we could look at what we got from photographs and take it into a way of excavating what this project meant. And we imagined an urban space made of houses of this nature, and what does it really tell us about the city if all houses were of this type. It needs to take the whole purpose of this was that the finality of the architectural photographic image needed to be broken down so that the conversation about architecture could move further. We did this for one of Madhav's buildings, Anagram Architects buildings as well, the Art Robot project, because we found that in some sense, the photographs and the kind of narrative that were at, one could sense the narrative, but they weren't coming across in the photographs. So we made drawings that talked about the intent of the architects, and then we did a collage which talked about the kind of dynamism of space that we imagined could be there. And this would be to further open up the dialogue that one could have with Anagram Architects or with other people about the meaning of such an institution house in the city. A few years ago, we finished a project, and we thought we should get it published. We had taken the decision that whatever we do, we'll publish it with our own photographs. This, we thought, would give a sense of candidness, a certain honesty, and would also have a certain intimacy with the project at hand. We, of course, are influenced by some of the mainstream ways that photographs are taken. So you do tend to, even in your own personal photographs, objectify the parts of the building that you are photographing. However, I think that unless one is able to break through the barrier of the architectural photograph as the final image of a project, you are not going to see a picture like this ever published in an architectural magazine. And yet, this is the most joyous space that I have designed in a building. Thank you.